Well, hello there, friends, and welcome in to the Real Life Practice Podcast. Lindsay and I are super excited to start into a brand new series here on the podcast. I hope you'll just stick around and listen in to some of the depth of where we want to go as we talk about stages of faith, questions that happen, and practices that might happen. So, Linz, I just want to dive in with a question for you, if that's okay.
Sounds great. I'm ready.
Okay, here we go. So, before we ever get started and really flesh this out and set up this new series that we're in, I know that you've lived a few years now. Have you ever been in a season of life where maybe there's a question that just keeps coming up over a whole entire year or for a couple of years that you can't shake? It kind of like follows you around in your quiet time and conversations. Maybe it wakes you up in the middle of the night. Just have you ever sat with just something keeps coming up?
Yes, I feel like particularly in seasons of transition, there
Mm,
might be, it almost seems like there's a theme in my life that comes up in conversations or in things I'm reading or in scripture. And it might have to do with a decision that I'm making or just something that's unsettled in me. And so
mhm.
it's almost like it just keeps resurfacing. And in a lot of ways, I'm grateful for that because it makes me feel like, okay, God is leading me into something. It's not just a bunch of random scattered things that he's trying to teach me or show me, but it's like the center that I keep returning to with God as he's trying to grow something in me or help me to discern something.
Mm, thanks for sharing, friend. I feel the same way too. And I don't think these questions that come in seasons of our life are meant to distract us. I actually think they are the spiritual life. They are not like, God leading us away from something and distract. They are actually his question that's within us. And I do think there's a pattern, as we're going to talk about in this series, in this episodes, of how our life asks certain questions in certain stages. And there's two kind of stages that I want to talk about and get into in this series. One is what we call stages of faith, and we'll define that a little bit here later on in this episode. And another is just these ideas of questions that come up in, say, decades of our lives, like our 20s, our 30s, our 40s, our 50s. And many times, in research and in knowing patterns of behavior, you're asking certain questions in certain seasons. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about. We're actually in this series going to interview people that are in these stages of life and these stages of years of life, both stages of faith and years of life. I want to dive in with you, even on this episode, of the fact that those don't always, it's just because you're in your early years, you have this, spiritual growth or development. They could coincide, but they're not necessarily exactly in alignment. So people can be at different places. So, welcome to the Real Life Practice Podcast. I'm Teresa. Lindsay's my co host. And we're grateful that you're here. And we're grateful that you're along for the journey to dive into this intersection of our stages of life and stages of faith and the questions that we might sit with, because questions are a part of how we practice our spirituality.
Absolutely. And I love that you highlighted that the stages of faith and our stage of life can coincide, but not always. And I've definitely experienced both. And it's interesting to me too to see how when we leave a question unanswered, and not that a question is ever fully resolved, but for example, if there's an early question in our life that we did not really fully immerse ourselves in and experience with
Mhm.
God, oftentimes we have to go back to it later in life. And so I've noticed that the questions can come back and there's more layers to them as we get older, and that can be a gift as well.
Such a great insight, because this is where the tools that we have of, like, the maps that we call them, the one life maps, can help us do some of that story work. And even then, the developing here at the Real Life Process, we teach the practice of rule of life. We call it a modern day rule of life. So as I answer these questions and where is God inviting me to live that out in my everyday life? So let's dive in just a little bit to frame this up in this episode and kind of share where we're going to be going. But I think first, let's talk about the reference of the resources that we're pulling from. Lindsay and I are both dear friends with Sibyl Towner, one of our spiritual mentors. She actually works here on our team, and she's one of the founders of One Life Maps. It used to be called Listen to My Life. It's now a tool here at the Rely Process. But Sibyl has done some other work just individually that we're actually going to be sharing as a resource here from this series. It'll be one of the resources that we have. And she has done this other work about the questions that different stages of life are asking. And when I say stages of life, I mean someone in their 20s, someone in their 30s, 40s, second half of life, even as Sibyl wouldn't mind us sharing, she's now in her mid 80s. And her and her husband, Dick, are sitting with different questions in that season of life. And we're hoping to have them on as guests in this series. And we just want to talk to people, everyday, ordinary people in these different stages and seasons. So you may be thinking of people you want to invite to listen. You may have a son or a daughter or a parent or someone that you're already thinking, oh, I want to invite them to listen to this particular episode. But Lindsay, let's talk a little bit about this work that Sibyl has done and just some of the questions that she actually has that, she's leading us to ask or leading us to recognize that these are what people are asking in these different seasons.
Yeah, I think that sounds great because what I love about this is that it connects our relationship with God, our faith, with our actual life and where we're at
Mhm.
right now. The external circumstances of things that are going on connect to the internal questions that show us what God is doing in our actual everyday life. They're connected, they're not separate. God wants to speak to where you are in your life right now, your circumstances, the everyday things that you're going through, and connect that to the deeper things that He is forming in you.
Yeah, so Sybil has this resource. She developed it several years ago, but it is a way of sitting with questions. There are questions and things that are coming up, and she calls them even key tasks that happen as early as in those first 5 years of development. What am I leaning into? What are the questions that even an early childhood, and you mentioned it earlier, Lindsay, when you were talking about sometimes we have to go back, questions like, how did you know you were loved in early childhood or early elementary? And sometimes we have to return to some of those questions. What did you learn in your elementary years to do well? Because these are forming and shaping us in that formational way. And even as we get into questions that come up in our 20s, what did you discover about yourself during those years? How was your gender affirmed? Who named or encouraged your uniqueness and pulled it out? In the process, we talk about talents, gifts, and abilities. That abilities piece many times is being developed in your 20s. You go to school to do a certain thing. You and I both chose musical paths. It's something we have in common because that was affirmed in us. It was a talent and a gift. And then we pulled it forward. But going back and looking at who was I in my 20s, if you're past that stage, and some of the things that were happening and being formed in you. So Sybil just has this great resource of adolescence, young adulthood, but then what's starting to develop even, and you're in this season right now. I'm a little ahead of you here, but in this 35 to 65, I'm right at the tail end of that. You're kind of in the middle. And for Sybil, she calls that midlife, right? A lot is forming in our midlife, and you start to reflect. And we find this in the work that we do with the process. People are reflecting on their early years now because you got some years on you. I know you don't want to admit that. We do. But, that's why I said, what are questions that you're sitting with? And you mentioned transition. life sometimes, I think in this season, feels like one big long transition as you're raising children and they're moving through their transitional phases. Anything else you would say? Because I know a lot of our listeners in that 35 to 65.
I think one thing that's interesting to me, especially that's helpful in doing story work, is I am sitting not only with my own question of midlife, but I'm sitting with my daughters who are late elementary school and noticing they are in that question of who am I? They're in that transition where they're kind of moving from child to preteen into that stage. And so I'm noticing what are the questions they're sitting with and how can I meet them in that? And what can be helpful is to go in my own story and notice how did I experience that question? What did that look like for me? And so
Mhm,
that informs not only how I show up as a parent, but also shows
mhm,
it really how I'm walking in questions now. Because for me in midlife, the question that Sibyl shares is how can I embrace and contribute to the world? So part of that is as a
mhm,
parent, how I'm showing up with my kids. Part of that is the work that I do. And as I continue to get clarity in what is my unique voice? What do I feel
mhm,
called to do? And my story informs that. So this is not just
mhm,
about doing, it's also about being who am I? Who has God created me to be? And how do I uniquely show up in the world? And those are a
mhm.
lot of things that I personally am sitting in right now.
Thanks for sharing because I think the other question, and we'll explore this more in some future episodes, though, is we get to midlife, and I'm to the tail end of that as I turn 65 this summer, and we can start to think we missed it. Like while all that transition is happening and we're raising children and we're finding our own self and we're finding the unique work that we were called to do, whatever that might be. Doesn't have to be pastoral. You could be working in an office space or leading a team of people. And sometimes we can feel like, did I miss it? And we start to have regret and we start to have, remorse and shame and all these things. So at every question, we're asking these. And I'm a very forward moving type. So I have to watch myself to not be thinking too far into my next stage and miss the current one I'm in and the forming that God is doing in me and the invitation to some of these questions. So, this midlife is another piece. And then for some of you that are listening, you've moved beyond that, mid 60s into the maturity years. I actually relate so much with what you just said, Lindsay. I posted yesterday in my little post that I do. I was just aware yesterday afternoon, I was driving home and I had driven about an hour and a half to be with my parents who are in their late 80s and early 90s, both still living at home, have some health issues, but they're very much self sufficient and all that. We went out to lunch together and all of those things. And then within a matter of hours, I shifted to watching my grandson, who is a little over 2.5 years old, and being with him. And I even went and did some crazy research. Sometimes I like to figure out crazy words and things. And I'm like, what are these seasons called? I think octogenarian is what my parents are in, if you look up the technical term, or many times called the silent generation because they were compliant. They did what they were to do. They lived during, either the depression or the end of the depression. So they have just such a different way of going about life compared to myself as a baby boomer. So here's Dale and I'm 1961. But you look at these different stages and then my daughter comes in the middle of the afternoon and, they're off to do something and I'm watching a toddler. And just the span of God's invitation to all of those stages of life, my own and my husband's included. And it all belongs and it's all beautiful, but to also recognize the questions my parents are sitting with. And I know you're in great, relationship with your parents as well. And you're listening to their stories and their questions. But what we can learn from even this series as we dive in is my parents are still in their own spiritual formation late in life. Our friend Sibyl and Dick Towner that we've talked about that we gain so much value from being with them, they're in their own forming years. And many times in those maturity years, it is the questions of gratitude. It's the questions of giving your life away, moving into some of those places of, you know, how do I want to end well my life this side of heaven? How do I want to be generous and begin that? Raul Rolheiser has written a lot, one of my favorite authors, about that. And so these questions are not just for you in our, oh, what am I looking at with me, but there's for those that you love and care for, and that empathy piece. What are your thoughts on that, Lindsay, as I kind of chalk through that? Because you mentioned it with your daughters, that you and your husband both have others, even as he pastors at a church. You have lots of generations, right? That we come in contact with.
I think it's so important to notice the questions that other generations and other stages of life are sitting with for many reasons. Like you said, it develops empathy. It helps us understand where someone else is with God, and it's not going to look the same as me. And that's okay. They're in a different place in life, whether they are at a younger, earlier stage or they are farther along. They are at a different place, and recognizing that is going to keep me from trying to project my own experience onto them. I
Mm,
also think it's so important to learn from people in other stages. So even as we do this series and interview people, whether they are ahead of you and we are learning the wisdom as they are sharing their story and what it looks like through the different years, or if they're at an earlier stage, like we said, there might be some things that we did not fully sit with. As someone in a younger or earlier stage
mhm.
talks about how they are experiencing God, we can learn from that too. And just to have that posture of teachability and curiosity that I can learn from people in other stages and that it's not going to look like mine and that that's okay.
It's okay and it's welcomed.
Mhm.
Like we have to hold that posture of open hands and welcomeness instead of that closed posture. Well, if it's not about me, it doesn't matter. So that's one resource, just one that we're going to use in this series. The other resource, and we'll touch on this briefly because we'll get into it more in each episode, but is something that has been written. You and I have both read the book. There's many books out there. We actually studied one last year, a different book on stages of faith. And so, how do these two intersect? Stages of life questions and stages of faith. And stages of faith are a different way of looking at where am I at on the faith journey. Churches have used this even in work that they do, but we're going to kind of lean more towards personal work and you being able to identify, your early development of faith, where you at. Sometimes, it's that seeker phase of when you first encountered your relationship with Christ and maybe came to your faith, whether that was early in life or later on in your adulthood, or maybe you had a reconnection later in life. Maybe you're still in that stage and that's something that you identify. And then you're moving forward in growth. And for many of us, there's a season and a place where we hit what is often described by Janice in her book, the wall. And what can happen, and I think this is important that we'll bring out in this series, is we can either move through the wall to the next stage of faith, or we come to that wall and we push against it. And unfortunately, we slide back. And we slide back in ways like, oh, I'm going to find a different church because this didn't need my need. Or I'm going to reinvent my life and run away from what that wall experience was because I don't know how to walk through it in my faith.
Mm.
I don't know how to keep my faith. So God must not be real, or he's not real for me. So I'm leaving my faith, or I'm looking for a new faith tradition. So many things that can happen there. But then there's the next stages of if I can walk through it with God. And some of the authors I love to read around formation, and I think about their stories, Dallas Willard and Henry Nouwen and Ronald Rolheiser, and I could name so many more around formation. they walked years through their wall. So it's not always going to happen. Oh, that was a hard year. You know, the wall may take a while and you may have more than one, you may have several, but then how you move through it and come to that next stage, the fourth, the fifth stages, and again, has nothing to do with maybe your years of life, although, some of us have traumatic or hard things early on, and then we might have to go through other development. So we're going to take that stages of faith. And Lindsay, I want you to say a little bit more about this as well. Along with, as we have these conversations, there's going to be a lot of great thoughts and things that are going to go on as we walk through this series.
So, a couple things that came up for me as you were talking. One is that when we talk about stages of faith, sometimes we can kind of assume, well, the higher stages are better.
Yes.
And that's not the way that helps me to look at it is think about the development of a baby into childhood, into being a teenager. You would never look at a 5-year-old who is acting childish and think that, well, they're just not where they should be. They are exactly where they're supposed to be. Development takes time and it's supposed to take time. With faith, I feel like there's some similarities there that our faith grows and changes over time, and one place is not better than the other. It's just recognizing where you are at, and there is beauty in every single stage, and we can learn from
Mm,
each other. And so that's something that I want to just kind of point out as we talk about stages of faith, that it's not about I'm going to achieve the highest stage that I can. This is a
yeah.
process of development. Just as we grow from childhood into adulthood, there's a lot of similarities there.
Mm,
Another thing that I think is so helpful with stages of faith, I know for me as I got into places where my faith, I kind of hit some of those places of a wall and of questioning and wondering if my faith could withstand that. Having language for it helped me see this is a normal
mhm,
part of the process. I am not the first person who's gone through this. This is to be
mhm,
expected. And that's where hearing the stories of others has been so helpful for me in my own journey is hearing other people who are following God so faithfully talk about the dark night of the soul, talk about the
mhm.
wall, talk about those times when they were really struggling to feel God with them and the way God then met them in that place has really strengthened my own experience of saying, okay, I'm not the only one. And here's what it looks like to stay in it with God and to keep moving forward.
So well said, friend. And I think that's where resources like books and podcasts and hearing other people's story, being in community with others where you're hearing those things can be so helpful. Putting yourself in mixed generational places. And what you shared about, you wouldn't expect a child. And so many times we put an expectation on someone's faith journey because of their age, and we look at someone in their 50s and say, oh, well, they should be, they should know better. They should be further along. And yet they have maybe just found their faith for the first time or found a deeper level of their faith. Maybe they've always, gone to church, gone through the motions, done all the things. So we can presume that there's been deep growth there. And maybe they just had that recently. So that empathy piece is huge. And the dark night of the soul, like we're in the season of Lent right now as we're starting this episode. And I just keep thinking of Jesus's own questions, his own dark nights of the soul. And he has been where you are. If you're at that wall stage, he has been there. He's been at the wall in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's been at the wall as he walked with his disciples, and they didn't get it. They were so human. And, his followers didn't get it. And he questioned so many things about the humanness of the journey he was on. So I am so excited to just dive into this. And so just know as we kind of recap, we're bringing a lot of things together, including what are practices that might be helpful. over this last year or so that we've been doing the podcast, carrying over from the original One Life Maps podcast and redoing this, I think for over a year now, we've mentioned lots of practices and we will come back to those: the practice of silence and solitude, the practice of retreat, the practice of journaling. We've mentioned. And so we'll keep building on those and keep sharing with you and hearing from the guests that we have on. What are they doing in this season that they're in? And so I probably haven't been as excited to have these kinds of conversations in a long time. And again, maybe it's just where I'm at, Lindsay, in my story as I'm coming up to kind of the big birthday, as they say, at 65. And I don't know why we think that's the big one, because nothing in my life is going to change. Well, maybe one little thing, but nothing much is going to change. But I think I'm pondering these questions. I know you are as well, as your life and season. So we might leave you with that. And then I'll let Lindsay wrap us up with where you can get in touch with us and all the resources. But what question is most alive for you right now?
Mm.
Not the question maybe you think you should be asking, but the one that is really there. As I asked Lindsay in the beginning, kind of the one that's following you around, as we say, keeps coming up when you're quiet in your car or when you're getting ready to go to bed at night, or maybe wakes you in the middle of the night of, you know, just that question. And it belongs. You're right where you're supposed to be. So, Lindsay, wrap us up with all the things. And we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks, because we go every other week with a drop of a podcast as we dive into the first episode in this series.
Well, we are so excited to explore this with you this season. And so definitely encourage you to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And like we mentioned, we always offer a free resource. And so if you want
Mhm.
to kind of look at Sibyl's work that she has done with the life development questions, that would be a great place to start, of just read through and notice what resonates with you. Is there a particular question that feels like an invitation to sit with God in that question? Even if it's not in your current life stage, it's still a question that is maybe an invitation for you to sit with. So check that resource out. It's in the show notes. Also check out, we have the tool we've mentioned of One Life Maps is now available digitally. We're so excited to make it available in that format, whether you use it for yourself or you get a subscription that allows you to use it in your work or ministry with others. Go to onelifemaps.com. That's in the show notes as well. And you can learn all about how to kind of connect with that resource and use it in your own life or work. So we are excited to continue moving forward, and we hope you'll join us again in a couple weeks as we, in this series, are continuing to embrace Jesus' invitation to learn the unforced rhythms of grace in everyday, ordinary life. We'll see you in a couple weeks.